It all started one lazy summer afternoon when I got home earlier than usual from my part-time job. I worked at a nearby coffee shop, and typically I didn't get back until late in the evening. But today, something had come up, and the manager let me off early. The house was quiet when I walked in, which was unusual since my stepmom, Hannah, always had something playing in the background, whether it was a TV show or music from the kitchen. Hannah was a vibrant woman much younger than my dad. He had married her after my mom passed away when I was just a kid. At the time, I thought she was the coolest person ever, a fun-loving stepmom who always had a way of lighting up the room. But recently, things between my dad and Hannah hadn't been great. I'm not sure what it was, but there seemed to be tension, arguments, and long silences. My dad, ever the workaholic, spent more time at his office, and Hannah spent most of her time either going out or staying at home doing whatever she did while I was at school or work. As a 19-year-old, I had my own life and didn't really pay attention to what they were going through, but something felt off. As I closed the door behind me, I noticed two pairs of shoes at the entrance. One was my stepmom's favorite pair of sandals, the other belonged to her best friend Linda. Linda was around Hannah's age, maybe a little older, and she had been a fixture in our house ever since they met. Linda was always around, laughing, gossiping, and, frankly, a bit too touchy-feely for my liking, but I never thought much of it. The two of them were practically inseparable. I made my way through the hallway, dropping my bag on the floor, planning to grab a snack from the kitchen before retreating to my room. As I neared the living room, I heard muffled giggling. I didn't think anything of it at first. It wasn't until I stepped closer that I froze, my hand resting on the doorframe. The sight before me made my heart stop. There on the couch was my stepmom and her friend Linda kissing. Not a friendly peck on the cheek, but a full-on, passionate kiss that left me standing there in utter disbelief. I blinked several times, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, they were all over each other, their hands roaming in places that made me feel sick to my stomach. I didn't know what to do. Should I make a sound, announce my presence, walk away? 100 thoughts ran through my head, but my feet were rooted to the floor. My mind screamed betrayal. How could she do this? To my dad? To our family? Linda's hand slid down to Hannah's waist, pulling her closer, and I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. This was wrong on so many levels. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing, but the proof was right in front of me. This wasn't just a friendly encounter, this was something much deeper. It wasn't just cheating, it was a betrayal that would shake my dad's world to the core. Just then, Hannah glanced up and saw me standing there. Her face paled, and she immediately pushed Linda away, straightening up on the couch. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, clearly panicking. I got off work early," I mumbled, still in shock. I could barely process what I had just seen. The air felt thick, oppressive, as the tension in the room grew. Linda looked away, her face turning an awkward shade of red, but Hannah didn't take her eyes off me. This isn't what it looks like," she tried to explain, but her voice wavered. Wasn't what it looked like. That was the most ridiculous thing I'd ever heard. I wasn't a child. I knew exactly what I had seen. My chest tightened with anger, confusion, and disgust. "Really? Because it sure looks like you're cheating on Dad," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. Hannah stood up, her hands trembling. "No, it's complicated. You don't understand." "I don't understand?" I snapped, my emotions boiling over. "You're right, I don't understand how you could do this. Dad trusts you, he loves you, and this is how you repay him." Linda shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent, clearly not wanting to get involved in the argument that was unfolding. I couldn't look at her without feeling a surge of rage. Hannah stepped forward, reaching out as if she wanted to calm me down, but I recoiled. "Please let me explain," she begged, her voice softening. It's not what you think. Linda and I, this just happened. We didn't mean for it to go this far." "That doesn't make it better," I shot back. "You're still cheating, and it's not just about you, it's about Dad. Say, how could you do this to him?" Hannah bit her lip, tears welling up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. She had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. Subscribe to the Betrayal Tales for more shocking and intense stories like this. If you like this story, comment your opinion in the comment section. I stormed out of the room before she could say anything else, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to hear her excuses or justifications. I couldn't believe what had just happened, what I had just witnessed. The image of them together was burned into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that consumed me. I went up to my room, slammed the door shut, and collapsed onto my bed. My mind was spinning, and I felt like I was going to explode. Should I tell my dad? Could I even look at him knowing what his wife was doing behind his back? I spent hours lying there, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. How long had this been going on? Had they been sneaking around every time Linda came over? And what would happen if my dad found out? The next few days were unbearable. I avoided both Hannah and Linda, barely speaking to either of them. My dad, oblivious as ever, carried on as if everything was normal. He had no idea his marriage was built on lies, and I didn't know how to tell him. Every time he smiled at Hannah, my stomach twisted into knots. But as the days passed, I realized I couldn't keep this secret forever. The guilt was eating away at me, and every time I saw my dad, I felt like I was betraying him too by not telling him the truth. So I made up my mind I would confront Hannah one last time and give her a chance to come clean before I told my dad everything. One evening when my dad was working late, I cornered her in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her back to me, when I spoke. "We need to talk." She jumped, startled, and turned to face me. "About what?" "About you and Linda," I said, my voice steady. "You need to tell Dad the truth." Her face went pale again, and she shook her head. "I can't. It would destroy him." "It's going to destroy him either way," I said firmly. "But he deserves to know. If you don't tell him, I will." Hannah looked at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Please, don't do that. I'll end it with Linda, I swear. I'll never see her again. Just don't tell him." I crossed my arms, feeling a surge of anger. "Do you really think that's enough? You've been lying to him for who knows how long. Ending it won't fix that." Tears streamed down her face, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered what I had seen, and the sympathy vanished. "You've already betrayed him," I continued. "You can't just pretend like it didn't happen." "I love your father," she whispered through her sobs. And I scoffed. "If you loved him, you wouldn't have done this in the first place." She wiped her tears away, her hands trembling. "You're right. I messed up. But please, just give me a chance to fix it." So I stared at her for a long moment, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to storm out of the room and tell my dad everything, but another part of me knew that this wasn't just about me. This was about him, and I didn't want to hurt him more than necessary. "Fine," I said after a long pause. "I'll give you 1 week. If you don't tell him by then, I will." She nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you." I left the kitchen without another word, hoping I had made the right decision. As the week dragged on, I watched Hannah closely, waiting for her to tell my dad the truth. But every night when he came home from work, nothing changed. They still ate dinner together, still made small talk, still pretended everything was fine. And every night I grew more and more frustrated. I had given her a chance, and she wasn't taking it. Finally, after a week had passed, I couldn't wait any longer. I had promised myself that if Hannah didn't tell my Dasselbaum, I would. And so one evening after dinner, I asked my dad if we could talk in private. He looked a bit surprised but didn't question it. We went into his office, and as soon as the door closed behind us, my heart started pounding. This was it. I had to break his world apart, and I wasn't sure how he would react. "What's on your mind?" he asked, sitting down in his leather chair, a warm, fatherly smile on his face. It made everything so much harder. He trusted me, and here I was about to shatter his trust in the person he loved. Well, I swallowed hard. Dad, there's something I need to tell you, I began, my voice shaky. It's about Hannah. Immediately, his smile faded, replaced by concern. What about her? Is she okay? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. She's been cheating on you, Dad. His brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? And I forced myself to look him in the eye. I saw her, with Linda. They've been seeing each other behind your back. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. Then he chuckled, as if I had told him some kind of joke. That's ridiculous, he said, shaking his head. You must have misunderstood. I didn't, I said firmly. I saw them, Dad. I saw them kissing. The room went silent, the air thick with tension. My dad's expression shifted from disbelief to a slow, creeping realization. He looked down at his hands, as if trying to process what I had just told him. No, Hannah wouldn't do that to me, he muttered, more to himself than to me. I didn't want to believe it either, I said softly. But it's true. I gave her a week to tell you, but she didn't, so now I am. He remained quiet for a long time, his face pale. The weight of my words seemed to sink in, and I could see the pain forming in his eyes. Finally, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the news had drained all the energy from him. I need to talk to her, he said quietly. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. I'm sorry, Dad. Without another word, he walked out of the office and headed toward the living room where Hannah was sitting. I stayed behind, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to hear the confrontation that was about to unfold, but I couldn't avoid it either. This was something that had to happen. I followed at a distance, standing just out of sight as my dad approached Hannah. She looked up, her smile fading when she saw the look on his face. What's wrong? She asked, her voice tinged with worry. He stood in front of her, his hands clenched at his sides. Is it true? He asked, his voice low and strained. Hannah blinked, her face betraying her fear. What do you mean? You and Linda, he said, his voice shaking. Have you been seeing each other? Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then, tears welled up in her eyes as she realized the truth was out. She stammered. I can explain. Don't, he snapped, his voice rising. Don't try to explain, just tell me the truth. Hannah looked down at her hands, sobbing quietly. Yes, she whispered. It's true, but I never wanted to hurt you. My dad stood there, motionless, as if her words had turned him to stone. The silence in the room was deafening, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on all of us. You never wanted to hurt me, he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. You've been lying to me for God knows how long, and you never wanted to hurt me. Hannah wiped her tears away, her body trembling. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. I don't know what came over me. It just happened. It just happened. He spat, his anger boiling over. You don't just happen to cheat on someone. You made a choice, Hannah. You chose to betray me, to betray our family. She cried harder, but my dad wasn't done. How long? He demanded. How long have you been sneaking around behind my back? Hannah hesitated, then whispered, a few months. A few months. His voice cracked with the weight of her confession. All this time you've been lying to me, pretending like everything was fine. I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I love you. You don't love me, he said coldly. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of Hannah's sobs and my dad's heavy breathing. I stayed where I was, my heart breaking for him. He had trusted her, loved her, and she had shattered that trust in the worst way possible. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft but filled with pain. I can't do this anymore. We're done. Adlaidwasanam. Hannah looked up, her face streaked with tears. No, please don't say that. We can work through this. I'll end things with Linda. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. My dad shook his head, his expression hardening. There's nothing to fix, Hannah. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. She reached out to him, but he stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Don't," he said, his voice full of finality. "Just don't." With that, he turned and walked out of the living room, leaving Hannah sobbing on the couch. Just stood there, my heart heavy with guilt and sadness, knowing that I had done the right thing but hating the pain it had caused. A few hours later, my dad came to my room. He didn't say much, just sat down on the edge of my bed and sighed deeply. And I could tell he was trying to hold himself together, but the cracks in his composure were starting to show. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shook his head. "Don't be. You did the right thing." I nodded, though the weight of the situation still felt unbearable. "What are you going to do?" He looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, but I can't stay with her after this." So we sat in silence for a while, the gravity of what had happened settling in. Eventually, my dad stood up, giving me a small, sad smile. "Thanks for telling me," he said quietly before leaving my room. That night I lay awake, my mind racing. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen now. Would my dad leave Hannah? Would our family ever recover from this betrayal? A few days later, my dad made the decision to file for divorce. He couldn't forgive Hannah for what she had done, and I didn't blame him. The house felt emptier without her, but at the same time there was a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and now we could all start to heal. As for Hannah, she moved out soon after the divorce papers were filed. I don't know what happened between her and Linda, and frankly, I didn't care. All I knew was that the betrayal had left scars that would take time to heal. Life after the divorce was tough, but my dad and I grew closer. We leaned on each other, supporting one another through the pain and confusion. And while the betrayal had hurt us both deeply, it also taught us the importance of trust, honesty, and standing up for what's right even when it's hard. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Betrayal Tales for more gripping stories of betrayal, cheating, and redemption. And if you have an opinion on what happened, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think.